started a series on worship and trying to look at worship in a couple of different ways. And so I hope that we're making some progress, and I hope that by the end we'll have kind of a different view of worship than simply something that we come here to do. I think that would be the one thing I would say, is that I want to move worship from an idea that we come here and we worship, and worship is singing, or worship is this, or worship is that. And instead that we would be able to see worship as really something that we do with our entire lives. Come to the realization that sometimes we are most wise when we don't own the situation. You ever been there? Somebody else has got a bit of a struggle, and you know exactly how to solve the problem. You want to know what to do in that case? Well, I'll tell you. For some reason, when it comes to us, we're a little less convinced that we know what we ought to do. Always easy to tell what somebody else wants to do, far less easy for us to give wise counsel to us. I think part of it is because what we have invested into it. You know, what I have invested into me, like I can see all the ways it can go wrong. You can go, well, this could go bad, but it's what you ought to do. Because after all, if it ends poorly, wasn't my problem. To be wise is to have understanding, discernment, and sound judgment. I think sometimes we kind of have a hard time defining exactly what it means for us to be wise, or for someone to have wisdom. We can go to a definition sort of like this one. It's to have understanding, discernment, and sound judgment, but I'm not 100% sure we always know sound judgment. Sometimes I think we overlook what maybe might not be so sound because we're looking at a personality. If you ask Google how to become wise, and where else would you go, frankly? Here's the advice that Google gives you. First off, you need experience. Google will tell you that you will not be wise until you have enough experience that you have had some ways that you can become more knowledgeable, which means that you are most wise when you are most old. Because that is when you've had the most experience. Second, you can pay attention to what wise people are doing and copy it. Now, Google doesn't tell you this, but I started to think about it, and if you are talking about the oldest individuals in society, paying attention to what they're doing and copying it means I should retire. Not sure that's very good advice. Third is to get wise advice, ask a lot of questions. First, you got to figure out who's wise. You got to be careful who you ask. Just because they might be older doesn't mean they're wiser. They could be troublemakers. Fourth, you need to be an expert on yourself. So in order to be wise, the first thing you need to do is know yourself well enough that you know what's good, wise advice and what's not. Psychology Today has this to say about wisdom and experience. They've studied this a lot, and here's what they would say. Wisdom and experience, not related. Not related. Between the ages of 25 and 75, the correlation between age and wisdom is 0. Which means you can be 25 and be very wise, and you can be 75 and not be very wise. And they've studied it. They've studied it. Intelligence only accounts for a 2% variance, which means it doesn't matter really how smart you are. Smartness and wisdom are not related. It can only give you a 2% variance. You might be 2% more wise if you're really a genius than if not. I know. I'm just really... Here's the conclusion. How wise you are is almost entirely rested upon your ability to be thoughtful. How wise you are is almost entirely rested on your ability to seriously sit down and think through a situation and really consider all of the different things and then make your decision. And when you're 25, you can sit down and be really thoughtful and come up with a really good decision. And when you're 75, you can just go out and act and then think about it and not be very wise. Last week, we talked about worship being obedience. That if we are going to be worshipers, one of the very first things we need to do is to obey God, to do what God really wants us to do. My question for us today is, how do wisdom and fear affect worship? How do wisdom and fear affect worship? We're going to go to a book that I know you guys have all probably memorized, Ecclesiastes. Okay, maybe you haven't even heard of it. Ecclesiastes is considered to be part of the wisdom literature in the Bible, so it kind of lines up there with like Proverbs and some of the ones that just basically are trying to tell you a little bit about how to become more and more wise, right? That's what wisdom literature is all about. It's said that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. I mean, that's the tradition. He actually didn't sign his name to it, and scholars will debate until Jesus comes back as to who actually wrote it and how it came about and how it ended up in the canon and all of that sort of thing. But Solomon, the son of David, who is the king, and so it's attributed to a king, and so anyway, we know a king wrote it, and the tradition says it was Solomon. Begins with an introduction. It's a very short introduction, but it ends with an epilogue, and they're convinced that the epilogue in particular is added later based on what is said in the book and how it is written, and kind of the fact that you have the teacher speaking throughout, and then at the end it says, well, these were the wise words of the teacher. And now here, let's sort of take it down into one simple thing, and that's the part we're actually going to look at today here in a little bit. So essentially, Ecclesiastes is filled with proverb-like advice. I want to make sure we get this, because sometimes proverbs are not exactly the easiest thing for us to understand, and they're little nuggets of wisdom, and sometimes they're said in such a way that, you kind of have to read between the lines, right? And so here's one of the things that proverbs, or a proverb, here's one of the proverbs from Ecclesiastes. This is Chapter 7, verse 9, it says, "Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools." Now that's good advice. It's wise advice. Because basically what it's saying is when you suddenly get angry at the turn of the switch, and I know none of us ever have anger issues at all. But anger is foolish. It's downright foolish. And if you're really easily angered, guess what? Anger resides in the lap of fools. Draw your own conclusion. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and show everyone how stupid they are. Not even 100% sure how to correlate this one. Even as fools walk along the road, they lack sense and they show everyone else how stupid they are. Next time you're walking by somebody who's acting a little crazy on the side of the road, just yell out Ecclesiastes 10:3. You know, you behave foolishly, everybody around you goes, must be a fool. I don't think we normally think of that. You behave smart, everybody goes, oh, that person must be smart. If you seem wise, people go, hey, can I get some advice? Because you seem to be very wise. If you're a fool, everybody just goes, look how stupid that person is. Pretty sure that's what they're saying. Here's another one. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. It's in the Bible. There you go. I find more bitter than death the woman who is a snare, whose heart is a trap, and whose hands are chains. The man who pleases God will escape her, but the sinner she will ensnare. If you're thinking, wow, my wife is godly.
Amen.
One of the phrases that you'll see repeated over, I know some of you are reading Ecclesiastes right now. Don't do that, I'm preaching. But you can read it later today. And one of the key phrases I want you to pay attention to if you should happen to be reading Ecclesiastes, because it's sort of the key to kind of figuring out what the author is trying to tell us, or what all this wisdom comes to. A key phrase is under the sun. Several times throughout the book he'll say, I've noticed that under the sun there is no, or under the sun this is what happens. You'll see it throughout it. Here's an example from the text, and this is chapter 5, verses 13 through 15. I have seen a grievous evil under the sun. Wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners, or wealth lost through some misfortune, so that when they have children, there is nothing left for them to inherit. Everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. So I've noticed that under the sun, this is the way it is. There are some people who hoard their money and don't use it for good, and there are some people who waste all their money and they don't even have enough to pass any on to their children. The reality is, you go out of the world the way you came in. You have the same amount of possessions when you leave as when you arrived. It's kind of an interesting way to think about it. Really, this idea of under the sun, it differentiates a worldly view from a heavenly view of living. So when you start to see this, look, under the sun, this is the way things are when you are on earth. By the way, be careful what you do with your wealth. But get this. You don't get to leave with any of it. This is the idea of here on earth. You see, you start to get this idea that the king, the writer, is a little bit of a Debbie Downer. Anger resides in the lap of a fool. Hey, in case you didn't know, you'll leave this place with the same amount as you had when you came. Well, isn't that a beautiful thought to have Sunday morning when we're worshiping God? You see, worldly pursuits are quite the folly when looked through the teacher's eyes. This king is writing and he's saying, look, you are doing all these worldly things, and any of these worldly things that you do are essentially not very important. Because after all, you can work all the time and you're still going to end up dead, and you're going to still end up with nothing. In a sense, what he's trying to tell us is, look, enjoy your life. Only a fool is going to go through life being angry. Only a fool is going to get caught up with, well, I hope you're not sitting here, but only a fool is going to get caught up with one of them women that's a trap. Only a fool is going to be so concerned that they think they're going to take the U-Haul with them into the grave. Here's the worst part. This is when I start to think that this wise teacher is little less than wise. Or maybe somebody needs to give him a little bit of Prozac or Zoloft or something. For the teacher, everything appears to be meaningless. Everything appears to be meaningless. Twice, not just once, but twice, once at the beginning of the book, once at the end, and I think a couple times in the middle, this is what is said. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Well, great. Isn't that exciting? Woohoo! The sermon is not meaningless. Come on. Some of you have a look on your face. Oh, I could have been somewhere else. To an extent, he even says that life is essentially meaningless. He uses the phrase that life is like chasing after the wind. You ever chased after the wind? There's enough of it around lately. Don't know where it starts or where it ends. How do you chase it? The question becomes, what purpose is there in life? Because if we're just going around as though we're chasing the wind, okay, maybe we shouldn't be angry. Maybe we should kind of enjoy life. Maybe we should enjoy our money, have enough of it to be happy, but don't hoard it, wherever that mark is, right? To find purpose, God is to be remembered, as this life is ultimately about Him. Remember what I said about under the sun? Careful about this under the sun. Be careful about that under the sun. Under the sun. Under the sun. You see, if we're going to find our purpose, we need to remember that this life is about God. That we are His people. That we are His children. And suddenly we will discover something totally different than what we may have thought of before. Because, frankly, if you have $1 million and you die, you don't care. Right? Some of the things we have to remember is that God is the giver of life. Solomon was kind of saying that. He's the one that wrote it. God gives us life. He's the one who makes it possible. You got to keep that in mind, because otherwise you might start thinking, well, it's okay for me to be angry. Even if everyone else goes, well, that's foolish. It's like nonsensical. But you see it happen. God is also the judge of humanity. The writer tells us that too. God is going to judge everything. He's going to judge everything that we do. And so if you stop and you start to begin to think, well, this is about God. The problem with all of this being meaningless is because we tend to make it about us. And we're good at that, by the way. We are outstanding at making things about us. You ever been in a room and somebody starts to laugh and you're sure it's about you? checking your zipper. Trying to make sure your nose is clean. One of the things that the teacher makes sure that we understand is that we need to remember God before we die. If you remember God afterwards, you're a bit too late. I was leading a Bible study one time, and somebody came in. I did not know this person, and I'm not sure exactly how it turned out, but she ended up sitting right here, which was basically right next to me in this Bible study, and we were discussing something, and how important it was to make a decision for Christ. And she said, well, why do we need to make a decision for Christ now? We can do it later. What do you mean? Whenever. Well, once you're dead, it's over. No. We get a second chance after we die. What? Where does it say that in this wonderful book? She was not thrilled with my answer to her, by the way. And I'm like, everybody will believe in Jesus when he's standing right there. And they realize that they're dead. Won't be hard to believe in Jesus then. Doesn't take a whole lot of faith when he's standing right there going, all right, is your name in this book? No, but I'd like it to be. I believe in you now. Thought about this, and you can read through this book, and when he keeps talking about how meaningless life is, seems like he's a pessimist. But like any good sermon, you're like, okay, where's the answer? Where's the answer? There's got to be an answer in there somewhere. There's got to be there. And that's where our passage for today comes in. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 9 through 11. Actually, it's a little more than that. But not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to his people. He pondered and searched out and set in order many proverbs. Now, this is the conclusion. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. You could probably say that's what he wrote was very wise. The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. Now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil. Thought about this, and I think that pretty clearly wisdom in life is careful thinking about what our purpose is. If we want to be wise people, we need to stop and figure out what is the purpose that we exist for. Why are we here? If nothing under the sun is going to lead us anywhere other than we're going to be born, we're going to live a life, and at some point we're all going to be dead and buried or cremated or whatever. Maybe you're going to be frozen to be brought back to life. Good luck with that, by the way. That seems like a really sad existence for humankind. There's got to be a bigger purpose, right? Than to just come and be. The teacher's given credit for thoughtfully considering life and its purpose and really sort of pointing out, and maybe not always the nicest way, but definitely in some of the more clearer ways, although mostly metaphorical, that you know what? Life is really meaningless. We'll spend a lot of time doing things and being in places and it means nothing. but that God does have a purpose for us, and if we can find it, we'll be doing much better. So what is the purpose of all of our activity, of all of our things? And by the way, I want to make sure that we're really clear here. I think one of the reasons why God has us here is to enjoy the life that we're able to enjoy. I don't think we need to be robots. I don't think we need to be all like any of that kind of stuff. I think it's okay that if you want to spend time doing something that's fun, you don't have to always just be going out and figuring out what, mission work you could be doing or whatever else. But ultimately, the conclusion of all the teaching is that life is meaningless without God. Under the sun, this worldly view, it's hard to find some purpose. But when you begin to realize that we can honor God, suddenly life is a little more purposeful. If life is meaningless without God, then the only response must be to worship Him. And if life on earth is somewhat meaningless, then worship must be when we take our lives and we turn them toward God. I think that's what it really is coming down to. We can worship through obedience, even when that obedience is costly. Please don't forget that. Obedience is worship. Sometimes that worship is costly. I think sometimes we think that worship ought to be inexpensive. I think also one of the things that the writer reminds us is that our reflections matter to others. You see, if the teacher doesn't share the wisdom, if he hoards it to himself, is he truly worshiping? Is he truly reflecting God? Is he really truly doing what he's supposed to be? So if the teacher shared the reflections, the teaching, the observations, so should we. When was the last time you were out and tried to share some wisdom specifically about God? I think a lot of times people ask for advice, and sometimes it's really simple advice, like where is the best place to see a dentist or to go to eat. We make those sorts of recommendations all the time. Some people have really wise ones. Some people you're not sure where their taste buds were. Do we really share our observations about God, our wisdom about who God is and what God really wants for us? Are we doing that? Perhaps part of the worship, the act of worship that we are supposed to be doing is to be as wise as we can be, to have thoughtful consideration of our purpose and how do we truly worship God in everything that we are, and then sharing that with others. Not in a way that says, hey, you know what, I feel like God says that if you really want to worship Him, you need to do this. I'll do it, but you got to do it too. I'm not sure that's worship. God may speak differently to somebody else. If we all went around doing the same things, how boring would that be? I think also part of what this passage tells us is that we should see wisdom as a motivator on a journey toward God. Any part of that sound familiar to you guys? Desert Grace is a community moving forward on a journey toward God. Wisdom ought to be a motivator along that journey. There's a phrase in there that, I actually had to figure out what it meant, because I kind of knew what it meant to goad somebody on. But the words of the wise are like goads. Goading people on toward God's. Well, I found out that goads apparently are some sort of stick that you can use to poke cattle to get them to go where you want them to go. You learn something new when you're a preacher every so often. I know some of you already knew that, but now you know. So the words of the wise are like goads, goading people on toward God. And so really what the writer is saying, that this conclusion, and probably somebody who added this conclusion is saying, look, all of these little pearls of wisdom are like these goads pushing you toward God. pushing you toward the way you ought to be, pushing you whatever, so that you would understand the way it's supposed to be. There's also a thing about nails, and all of these are like the good shepherd's words, or the one shepherd's words. And there's some commentaries that say that the shepherd must be God. It's sort of a word we use for God. Some say, well, it's probably just referring back to King Solomon or whatever king wrote this. But this idea that there's a shepherd who's leading us and saying, listen, life is meaningless unless you have God in his rightful place. You've got to have God where God belongs. The warning against adding words or studying too much is sort of a challenge. It's a challenge on a couple of things. One is, how do we learn more how to be wise if we're not reading and studying? By the way, we have a lot of options for you to engage in Bible studies. This is not what this is talking about. Study less. No. Study Bible studies more. Become more wise. But we've been guilty from time to time of adding words. We've been guilty from time to time of studying a little too much, of being a little too into that. And here's the bottom line. Action towards God is better than thought. You've heard of analysis paralysis, haven't you? Need to make a decision. It needs to happen soon. And let me figure out what I'm going to do. And I can go this way, and I can go this way, and I can go this way, and I can go this way. And which one of these? And we go, okay, well, here's the good part about this. Here's the good part of that. And you're so busy studying it that you've missed your opportunity. You end up doing nothing. And I think that's part of what this is getting at. Listen, you can't just sit around thinking about God all the time and think you're going to be holy. At some point, you have to think about God, what's going to make me holy, and go do it. Even if it's wrong. I don't want us ever to forget that worship is active. Worship isn't just merely an emotion or an ideal or some sort of far-out thought. You see, you got up, just making sure, you all got dressed, you somehow made it into a vehicle or used your feet or whatever else, and you are in this room. At what point did worship begin? Right? I will wake up in the morning and I will go to church. If you took a shower this morning, you were worshiping God. Unless you only did it to impress somebody else in the room. You got dressed, thank you. We're not that kind of church, so we appreciate you getting dressed. And sometimes the church, I mean the big church, not the little church, us, gets really caught up in numbers, right? Oh, you're only saying people should come to church so that there'd be more people here so that you can report a bigger number on your reports. I don't care. I really don't. But here's the truth. Worship this morning would not have been the same if you weren't here. It's just the reality of it. When we all come together and we sometimes worship in different ways and different things in our mind and different voices and all of that, it's not the same when you're not here. I think it's possible to overstudy and miss God in the process. If you like to read the Bible through in a year, that's great, but make sure you're reading the Bible through in a year and getting everything out of it that God wants you to get out of it. Because otherwise, you're just in a race to the finish. Is that really worship? I think it's possible to miss God. It's truly possible to unthinkingly add rules to wise ideas, and the church has been plenty guilty of this. We want people to remain pure, so then we start defining what that looks like. And by the way, aren't you two sitting a little close today? You're married, I guess it's all right. We got to be careful, don't we? In the end, we are all called to fear God and obey. That's what follow his commands means. I didn't want you to have to write all of that, so I just put obey. To fear God and obey what he has told you to do. By the way, I will point this out too, that when the writer says all his commands, this will help you, I promise. What he means by all is all. Some of you have a confused look on your face. All means all of them, every one of them. Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you up. Because it's more fun to pick and choose. God says this, okay. God says this, oh, hold on. Some of you still drinking Pepsi, but I don't know what to say about that. Teacher reminds us also that God will judge some of our deeds. Every deed, both those that everybody sees and knows about, and some that maybe they don't. Fortunately, I know in a room like this, there's very few things that we keep secret. Everybody knows everything about us. We're really open people, and so all of those unseen deeds, we just come in and confess them and get good, wise counsel on how to avoid doing those things in the future. What? Wow, you guys got quiet and you have funny looks on your face. It says that God will judge every deed, good or evil. Which, by the way, means that God wants to judge them good. That would be worshipful, right? This fear is about revering God, and I thought about revering God, and sometimes we just assume we know what something means. Usually we're pretty right, but I'm going to define it for you, because if I don't, I won't be doing my job and you won't pay me. To revere is to show devoted, deferential honor to regard as worthy of great honor. To show devoted, deferential honor to. So if we're going to revere God, we are going to show God devoted, deferential honor. Right? That made it clear for all of you. I can tell by the looks on your faces. All right, fine. I'll explain each word by word. Devoted is loyal, faithful, steady, dedicated. It means you don't go, oh, look, God is so awesome. I can't wait to follow God wherever he might lead me. And you're just so excited. And then you go, oh, look, a flashy car. I want that. No. If we're going to be devoted, loyal, faithful, steady, dedicated, it's to God. Even when it's like, that kind of sounds like fun. But it means that I have to turn my back on God for a little bit. Can't do that. Deferential, dutiful, respectful. Here's the tough one, giving preference to. Deferential means that we are going to give our priorities, that the number one priority is to whoever we are revering. My question for you isn't so much, do you think that you give God this sort of treatment? My question would be more, who or what are you giving that kind of treatment to? That must be important. Honor is merited respect. You know the difference between unmerited and merited, right? Deserved and not deserved. Honor is deserved. Something has been done that means it should be. In other words, reverence is about love. It's about devotion. It's about respect. It's about making sure that we are completely faithful, loyal, and that the most important thing in our lives is that which we revere. Come to the conclusion that God should have priority in our lives. He should have our worship. Because whatever we revere is what we will worship. And if people look around and say, this is what it seems like you revere, is it the kind of thing you want them to say you revere? Is it God? How do wisdom and fear affect worship? Well, here's the first thing. Recognizing the need to be wise acknowledges our purpose in life is worship. See, wisdom is not so much about, look at how smart I am, look at what great decisions I can make. It's more about saying, look at what a wonderful God I serve. And that as much as I can become wise, it's for one purpose and one purpose alone, and that is to worship God. Anything other than glorifying God? Probably not so wise. If you're wise and you're not glorifying God, well, you're missing something. But anything other than glorifying God is meaningless. Now, I want to be really careful because I'm worried that sometimes we get stuck in this mindset and we think that the only way that we worship is if we're sitting in this building. And I've been telling you, stop that. It's not true. It just simply isn't true. If we're going to be clear about this idea, we are often worshiping our best when we are using God's gifts to us in the calling that He has called us to do. Now that'll change things a bit. Because one, it's not limited by where you're at. You can wake up in the middle of the night. Maybe God's gift to you is that of intercessory prayer. And you wake up in the middle of the night and immediately you think of somebody who needs prayer and you just jump into that prayer. Guess what? That's worship. And you remember these seen and unseen deeds? Most people are not going to be seeing you in the middle of the night praying for somebody. God's going to judge that. Good or evil? Good. There's other things you can do in the middle of the night. He'll judge other ways, but that's beside the point. Worship is using wisdom and honoring God in all things. You want to be a wise worshiper? Know your purpose. What did God call you to do? What is God asking you to do right now to worship Him? And I don't mean right here, right now, in this building. I mean when we walk out the doors, because that's where your worship really becomes important. Listen, I wasn't going to say it. Well, I was going to say it, and then I cut it out, and I won't put it back in. Lots of times we come to church, and we pretend like everything is perfect. Right? We walk in and we smile and we act like everything is just wonderful in life. It's sort of like Facebook where we only post the good stuff. And if somebody does go post something like this has been the worst week of my life, everybody else just rolls their eyes and moves on? No. We're only here for our happy thoughts. We wouldn't want other people to know that we're broken and we need God. I think sometimes we worship God by acknowledging that we are broken people, surrounded by broken people, and that we're all just trying to get healed through the power of God, that we would become more and more like Christ. Nearly every decision that we make is a decision that either honors or dishonors God. Think about that. Think about it. Almost every decision you make is a decision that can either honor or dishonor God. I don't have time to talk more about that. Let me put it this way. Nearly every decision is an opportunity to worship. We can talk more if you're still confused. How are you using your opportunities? You make more decisions than you even know about in the course of a day. I mean, there's those that you know about. Some of you have already decided what you're going to have for lunch. Others of you still thinking about it. Did you know you can honor God in those sorts of decisions? When you leave, you're going to probably drive. Someone will be. You'll at least be riding as a passenger in the car. How you see the world around you is a decision. How are you using that opportunity? Sometimes you have time on your hands, and you hear us say things like, "Would you please help us out and do this or do that?" You have a choice. You can honor God, and sometimes you can dishonor Him. Now, I'm not suggesting that every time you are invited to help out, you have to say yes or you're dishonoring God, because sometimes by saying no, you actually honor Him. You just throw that out there. But some of you, God might have said, "Hey, that might be something for you," and you go, sounds like a lot of work. I better stop, or you guys will stop listening. A healthy fear of God makes Him priority in our lives and makes Him our Lord. As a kid, did you do things your parents said to do because of desire or because you were afraid of what your parents might say or do? If you are under 18, you don't have to answer. I've thought about this a lot. I have a couple kids at my house. I know most of the time they don't want to do whatever it is I'm asking them to do. I've thought about this, and sometimes I think they do it because they're afraid that if they don't, they won't get to have some fun later. Sometimes I think it's because they care about me. Not so much that they want to do it, but because, since it's you asking, and I care about you, right? Shouldn't we see God sort of the same way? God, I don't really want to do that, or I don't really want to, but you're God, and if I'm going to obey, that's how I worship. We can't make it a fear of punishment. I want to make sure we're really clear of that. God is not out to get us. He's not that kind of God. Listen, if you are the almighty, most powerful God, do you really want people to love you because they're afraid that you'll send a lightning bolt? There's not much love in that. "Oh, love me or I'll kill you." Okay, I love you. That's not the fear we're talking about. Eternity in hell, to me, doesn't sound very good, and I don't want us just to be afraid of hell either. But it should be a fear of becoming like God. Now, I'm really carefully trying to use this phrase here, but I want you to think the Genesis to be like God. The fear shouldn't be that God is out to get us. It should be a fear of becoming like God. And essentially, that means that we become like Adam and Eve and say, well, look, we can become like God. We should become more like Christ because He set an example of how we could live. But we can't be like God. The problem with being like God is we begin to worship ourselves. You've met people that do that. And I hate to tell you this, but some of you are guilty. I won't point fingers or call out any names. But it happens. Who are you worshiping? Maybe it's what are you worshiping? Everything you do is worship. The question is, who is it intended for? Is it intended for you? Is it intended for God? Is it intended for people around you? So many different ways that this can be. Do you have a wise fear this morning? I think if we're going to have a wise fear, it's so simple. What did we say you had to do to become wise? Thoughtfully consider. What do you have to do to fear? You have to revere God. Be dedicated, loyal, loving, all those things we spoke of. We still friends? Heavenly Father, we just ask that you'd give us a wise fear. That we would understand what it is that you want us to do in order to worship you. That we would carefully think as we leave this place of the things that you have called us to do, the things you have called us to be, and that we would consider how closely we are revering you. Lord, if you are not the number one priority in our lives, help us to see that and make it the truth. Make it be who we are. That we would be people who worship you in everything we do simply because you are number one in our lives. That we understand what it means to fear you and to obey. Help us if we have any unrealistic expectations of what worship means. And help us to replace it with the realization that as we become wise, as we become obedient, we are truly doing the worship you have called us to do, and we're truly doing the worship that you desire. We just ask that you'd speak to every one of us this morning. Help us to become better worshipers. Be with us as we leave this place. Guide us, direct us, until we have the opportunity to worship together once again. In your name we pray. Amen.